Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Gabby. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. A quick note that pizza will be served at the end of today's forum. Today's forum is titled Water Stories, Conversations and Connections to the Great Salt Lake, and is presented in partnership with the Utah Presents and the University of Utah Sustainability Office. I will now hand it over to Francis from the Sustainability Office for some opening remarks.
On behalf of the University of Utah Sustainability Office, I thank you for joining us. Today's event explores our personal and physical relationships to Salt Lake City's regional water bodies. Utah is a semi-arid state with a growing population, and its water future is one of the most significant challenges that we face. More than 60% of Salt Lake City's water starts in mountain streams from our nearby Wasatch Canyons. We were blessed last year with a deep snowpack to feed our streams and supply our reservoirs. But climate change is bringing less snowfall, warmer air temperatures, earlier spring runoff, and dwindling surface water supplies. Urban sprawl is encroaching into our natural habitats and water supplies, while industrial and agricultural activities can pollute our water sources. Our Great Salt Lake is stressed by inconsistent water levels and periodic drying, which threatens regional ecosystems, degrades air quality, and impacts human health. But we know that Utahns cherish the rivers, lakes, and snow-capped mountains, not only for their economic support of their state, but also for their beauty. In the past in this room, we've had a chance to discuss the science and policies surrounding the Great Salt Lake during our forum in fall of 2021, which you can find on YouTube. Today, through our diverse panel, we will learn about the connections between the health of the Great Salt Lake and our own physical and mental health, as well as our personal relationship to natural water sources. No single person or single discipline is going to be able to solve our water challenges. It takes a variety of people, professions, and perspectives.
We are excited to have some great panelists today. Sarah Woodbury is an earth-based poet, performance artist, storyteller, and socioecology researcher who works in embedded conversations with the sentient world. Her work entangles humans with earth, cosmology, or an understanding of the sacred wildly enfleshed in more than human beings around us. She also researches settler and LDS land relations as part of both Shoshone projects restoring the site of the Bear River Massacre and downstream efforts to save the Great Salt Lake. Dr. Brian Mensch is a former adjunct faculty member of the University of Utah Honors College. Teaching public health and environment, he is the president and co-founder of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, UPHE. Since 2007, UPHE has become one of the largest civic organizations of medical professionals in the western U.S. Dr. Mensch is also on the board of chairman for Doctors and Scientists Against Wood Smoke Pollution. His work includes dozens of op-eds and a nomination by President Obama for the Champions of Change Award for his work on public health and the climate crisis in 2013. Lisa D'Amour is a playwright, educator, and interdisciplinary collaborator from New Orleans. She came up in a world of ritual activism, group spectacle, and care, all of which continue to thrive in her work. Recent work with Pearl D'Amour includes Ocean Filibuster, a genre-crashing human-ocean showdown, currently touring. Milton, a performance rooted in 5 small U.S. towns named Milton, and How to Build a Forest, an 8-hour performance installation. Lisa's play, Detroit, was a finalist for the 2011 Pulitzer Prize, and she is a recipient of an Alpert Award for the Arts, a Steinberg Playwright Award, and a Doris Duke Performing Artist Award. Today's conversation will be moderated by Daniel Hernandez. Daniel is Winak, urban Diaspora Highland Maya, descends from many peoples and has local ties to the Rose Park community in Songani, Salt Lake Valley, and Tamakmakoro, Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He is currently the Director of Culture for the Tracy Aviary and the Nature Center at Pia Kaui Jordan River Nature Center, where he is working on local global indigenous eco and food justice projects alongside place-based pedagogy research with diverse communities. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
Tagoyak, Twayo. Oh. Ahehe, Ashinsa'i. Thank you in the first languages, indigenous languages of this place. Also, gracias, Maltiosh, Whakapeta'i, kia ora, salamat, and also thank you in languages that are common here as well, especially in the neighborhoods that I come from. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to help moderate today, and we're just going to jump into it with the first question, or I guess I'll say question, but sometimes I frame things as comments, and so I will allow you to answer or respond or comment in response as well. And so the first one was thinking about water memories. And so the first question is think about first water memory, but also I got your email, Lisa, of some additional suggestions, and so I want to twist it up a little bit and see if you'd prefer or if you'd like to as well talk about a formative water memory. So if there's something that has informed the way you think about water, or if something that was formative in rethinking how you think about water. And to bring you into the space a bit more, we'll start with you, Lisa, joining us from digitally. And yeah, first water memory or formative memory in thinking about water.
Just one moment, Lisa. Just troubleshooting.
I think that was me.
Oh, there we are.
Hi, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Yes, I live in New Orleans below sea level, so there are a lot of water memories. And one that I often go to is I grew up a lot on the Gulf Coast, especially in Pensacola, which is a beach area on the panhandle of Florida. And I would go there with my family and my grandparents. And I spent a lot of time growing up in the waves, and there's this memory that I have of my grandmother picking up a jellyfish in her hands, so she wasn't really afraid of it at all. And I'm not sure where there was some orifice. I don't know how she knew it was there, but she would literally like bring it to her mouth and inflate the jellyfish with her mouth and then put it back into the water. And it was like mesmerizing to me because my grandmother seemed all powerful, of course. But thinking back, it was just like, it seemed like an action that she had been doing since she was a little girl. So I really felt like this connection between the water, the creatures in it, enjoying the ocean. That memory just has a lot of texture to me. So I'll start with that one.
Oh, awesome, thank you. We'll go to you, Sarah, and then Brian after.
Yeah, I like the thought of a formative water memory. What comes to mind for me, I guess one of my earliest water memories is drinking from the hose. I grew up here with a view of Great Salt Lake, and I have early memories with Great Salt Lake, like with brine shrimp in my swimsuit. But drinking from the hose is my earliest memory interacting with water and like loving this glimmering like, little hose that seemed magic to little me. A formative memory, though, is with Great Salt Lake, which I've done a lot of work with and around. I, as a teenager, actually remember going out there, and for some reason, I don't know what I was doing, but I was just like scooping up all of this mud and clay and just like covering myself. And I remember just laughing, like just full of joy. And that's probably my happiest memory, and one that I've returned to throughout my life, is just like being with this mucky water body. Yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Awesome.
Of all the panel discussions that I've ever been on, this is a question I've never been asked. My first memory with water was when my mother's water broke and I was born 5 minutes later. Of course, that's a lie. Actually, my first memory probably has a connection to the University of Utah, because that's where I learned to swim. My father would take me up here when I was about 5 years old. And the old Iron Nielsen field house used to have this big swimming pool in it. And you'd enter it from the basement, and you'd climb up this enormous flight of stairs that looked like you're entering some sort of silo. And then there's what would open up are these two massive pools that to me look as big as the Pacific Ocean. And that's where I learned how to swim. And ever since then, I can't say that I've been terribly engaged in water issues until a book that I read that I told the other panelists about a few minutes ago, and I'll discuss that in more detail later, about the critical role that the oceans play in our survival, all the more so as we barrel towards perhaps a apocalyptic outcome the oceans will play a critical role in whether or not we survive.
On that happy note,
Yes.
I was thinking as well. I'm just going to jump in there because I couldn't think of a specific example, and then I started thinking about heaps of them. And then after I was like, oh, I wonder what's like underlying them. And for me, I think one of the underpinning memories that consistently appears with water, formative water experiences, is the unstabling effect of water. And my sister's much better on water than I am. And she talks about the difference of being on a liquid surface versus a physical one. And so I think for me, there's something that's very powerful that can feel like it's dangerous, but also can feel very inspirational. And so I just wanted to throw that one out there. It's like there's this destabilizing liminal component of water that I do appreciate. And kind of locating us a little bit more here, I did want to ask a question around thinking about the Great Salt Lake, or Piapa'a, Tizimpa, as it is known in Noa, or Shoshone and Goshute, or Lago Salado, which I hear all the time in Spanish, or Anomasima from Le'efagatonga. So there's all these words and relationships to this body of water here, or in English, of course, the Great Salt Lake. And so throwing it out to everyone and thinking about what have you heard of, or what do you think of, or what do you observe to be the perceptions around the Great Salt Lake, especially with recent crises that we face and awareness around it. And again, with Lisa, if you want to connect it to other issues, but I'll also be keen to hear what you've heard from the national kind of perspective. And we'll start with Brian on this one.
I think the public's perception of the Great Salt Lake has changed dramatically in the last few years. I think I'm fairly typical of a resident here in the Salt Lake Valley. Spent most of my life here, with the exception of a year, my freshman year in college, and then residency and training in medicine. I did the obligatory LDS mission in New England. With a few years exception, I've been here all my life. And I've had no spiritual, intellectual, or recreational connection to the Great Salt Lake in any way, until it became obvious that this was pivotal, or I should say managing the Great Salt Lake in an appropriate way would be pivotal in maintaining a livable climate here along the Wasatch Front. Then things changed dramatically for me personally. And I think that's probably true for an awful lot of people. Now that more and more awareness is spreading about how important preserving the Great Salt Lake will be to maintaining livable air quality, how important it will be to maintaining the levels of precipitation that we know are imperative in terms of our future survival here. No civilization survives for very long without water. And the Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake have a dynamic role to play in maintaining the amount of precipitation that's available to us, and therefore our water resources. So my perspective on this issue has evolved dramatically in just the last few years, and I think a lot of people have experienced the same thing, hearing things like international news stories where our local scientists from BYU and other institutions say, if we don't do something dramatic, we're going to lose the lake in the next 5 to 10 years. That story has been multiplied numerous times throughout the international media, and so now we're starting to get it. Let me editorialize here for just a second. There's a significant body of our population who's not getting it yet, and that's our legislature. Don't get me started on that, and I'll hand the ball off to you.
Shall I go next?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that there's been a massive shift. I've been interested to, I grew up here and was lucky to have some interactions with Great Salt Lake growing up and kind of have an early relationship. But I guess there's always been kind of this like strange group that's like lake people, and it's not everyone, and it's kind of an uncommon thing. But I've noticed through the work of a lot of folks, a lot of really good artistic and cultural and legal and advocacy work and scientific work. There have been scientists doing this work for 10, 20 years, spreading information about Great Salt Lake. So yeah, I've seen a cultural shift just in the last like 5 years that's been pretty encouraging to me, especially thinking about activism and how art interacts with activism. it's been pretty special to watch more and more folks become involved with Great Salt Lake and want to visit Great Salt Lake and see and get to know this being. It brings me some grief to know that it's in the context of potentially losing this ecosystem and this being. But I do still have a lot of hope in the fact that a lot of people are turning their head toward this being. So, yeah.
Can I just add, recently our physicians group has had numerous artists from various disciplines, visual arts, painters, poets, performing arts, reach out to us and ask us, what can they do to help raise public awareness for that? So this panel discussion fits very much into the kind of pattern that we've seen over the last year.
I'll ask more about that in a little bit. Lisa.
Yes. As someone that's driven through part of Utah, and that's about it, I definitely have heard a lot about the Great Salt Lake reducing in size over the past few years and droughts affecting both the lakes and the streams that feed it. And we were very interested in bringing our play, Ocean Filibuster, to you all because it's actually the first place we brought it that's pretty far away from an ocean. But that is dealing with water issues. And so I'm very curious to see how our play is going to be in conversation with what you all are dealing with right now. It's exciting to me to hear about people becoming more aware of the issues around the Great Salt Lake, because I feel like what I'm experiencing in New Orleans is, we basically live in the water, but people who live here in New Orleans, they don't really think about that so much. They enjoy the creatures that we eat that come out of the sea. They sometimes enjoy the weather, sometimes not. But they don't realize that the water is that is encroaching upon our state, upon Louisiana, is like a 15-minute drive away. And I'm really interested in how we can change our perception to people being very involved and literally engaged in a hands-on way with their water ecosystems where they live. So that's not abstract. It's something that they are living with every day. So that's something that I'm thinking a lot in terms of my play and also where I live.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with you, Lisa, with this next question. Have you start us off on that and build off of what you've just shared. And this is a chance for each of the panelists to share a little bit of the work that they do, and thinking about the methods of the public engagement, right? The community engagement components, be it writing, be it performance arts, be it visual arts, and thinking about how those methods bridge the conversation, and whether that's specific to the Great Salt Lake or to water more generally in the ocean, and what role you see that playing out. And I'll add this other one because you did mention this one previously, and I think it's a good one to think of is, has it also pushed you out of your comfort zone, right? So if you're used to having a conversation around your work with a certain group of people, when you're engaging with the public or engaging with the community, different communities, has that pushed you to work with other groups that maybe you haven't in the past, and thinking about that as well. So we'll let you share a little bit about your work and the impact that thinking about it in terms of sharing it with the public has.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, in terms of the strategies that I try and use, and we have this show that is very much about the ocean and our relationship with water and how humans are water, of course. And then we have another show called How to Build a Forest, in which we invite audiences into a forest as humans are trying to make it, as we're trying to kind of build it. And I think that I'm always thinking about how can I help an audience leave behind the stress and busyness of their outside lives and zoom into this issue in an intimate way that relates to them. And so I'm always thinking about precision and detail, but I also think a lot about humor and how humor can engage an audience to kind of lighten up when we're thinking about some of these issues that can be really overwhelming and hard to grasp. In terms of making the work and going out of my comfort zone, what's been amazing about Ocean Filibuster is I have collaborated with so many scientists in making it, and also local environmental organizations in each city where we tour the work. So, for example, when we did the show in Miami, we created a local intermission experience in which we built a simulated coral reef And there was a game associated with it called Thrive or Die. And that was made by some students from the university, some scientists from Rescue a Reef, from a place called the Earth Institute, which thinks more philosophically about Earth issues at the University of Miami campus, and us. So there are these people from very different worlds coming together to be creative and think through these issues. And I just think that's like the sweet spot, right? Because it's so hard to find the time to meet people outside of our silos. And I really think that in order to live with this crisis, to steward the earth that we love, the water that we love, we really have to break out of these silos and work together.
Thank you. Turn it to you, Sarah, and then.
Yeah. Gosh, I love this conversation. One thing that is coming to my mind is the words of Darren Perry, who's an elder of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, who talks about specifically with the Great Salt Lake, we have the science, we have the knowledge about what's going on with the lake at this point. We have for a number of years, and that's been, there have been dedicated scientists working on this piece. What we need right now is the stories. Stories are what reach people, and so that's been something I've been really moved by and interested in my own work. A number of years ago, myself and a couple other local artists embarked on this film project for and with Great Salt Lake, where we approached the lake for consent and learned from the lake throughout our process in creating this movement and poetic piece. And since then, we've kind of been building upon this work of like bringing other bodies into our own. I think this is something unique about performance art is, I'm thinking of the words of one of my collaborators, Ray Lubert. I can't remember who she was quoting, but she describes the body as a bridge, that our bodies can become bridges for these issues as performers and as artists. And so, we've worked with, observing and looking closely at birds and at water and at, pastel skies over the lake and trying to ask big questions about how we can and can't embody or speak with some of these beings. And as far as getting out of your comfort zone, I just came from the Capitol where myself and Bryn and Ray, my collaborators, we moved with these giant bird heads in the Capitol. And that was definitely getting out of our comfort zone. But I think as we've kind of figured out what it means to be in a good relationship with this work and with these beings that we're learning from, we've brought our bodies to the Capitol, and it's a stark space. It's marble. It's like quite imposing, but we just went in there as birds as best we could, and definitely a lot of getting out of comfort zones. But yeah, I do think as well I do poetry work, and a piece of that has been getting folks into their bodies by turning them toward the bodies of other than human folks around to learn from them and to feel connected with this web of life that we're a part of.
Thank you.
I'm going to expand a little bit on a thought that Lisa raised, and that is the importance of humor. Whenever I go outside or leave the house and I tell my wife I'm off to give a lecture, she says, "Oh, are you going to give them another one of these, oh, we're all going to die speeches?" And she's right. That's pretty much what I specialize in. I tell audiences, it's okay if when I'm done, you have post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's actually what I'm shooting for. Not quite. But when I'm trying to describe to an audience, whether it's medical students, whether it's the public, whether it's legislators, if we can ever get an audience like that, and try and tell them what the public health consequences are of the overall environmental pollution that we're allowing, as well as the environmental perturbations related to the climate crisis. It's a very stark and disturbing message. If you look carefully at what the climate scientists are telling humanity, they're telling us humanity may actually lose modern civilization as a result of our ignoring the climate crisis. What could be a worse message than that? So, in order to have people not immediately recoil, nobody likes bad news. If you know the rent's coming in a couple of days and it comes in the form of an envelope, a lot of people don't want to open that up because it's pretty much bad news. If it's a note from the IRS, if it's a note from whoever it is that might deliver bad news, the natural reaction is to recoil and not want to be exposed. That's normal. So I think it's important to try and lighten things up periodically. And so my goal in a lecture that I might give to just about any audience is to try and make them laugh and cry and scared as hell all at once. And I think that's very helpful in this sort of a discussion with regard to the Great Salt Lake.
I'm not crying yet, I'm waiting. No, that's great. Thinking about audiences, and want to push this a little bit further and broadening it a little bit, because this is a really important conversation. It's one that I am involved in now. It's not one that I was always involved in, right? And so this would fall into what I would have called, the environmentalist realm, and the environmentalist to me growing up looked a certain way, usually not like me, usually skinnier. The term granola comes to mind, so people that eat granola or whatever that might be, right? Hippies and so on and so forth, right? And I grew up with a lot of ideas based on the neighborhood that I grew up in on, who did that kind of work, right? And so later when I found out the origin of tree huggers being in South Asia, that kind of flipped a lot of things for me, right? Because I had associated that, coded it in a different way. So with that in mind, I want to ask each of you to think about this shared crisis that we have on one hand, but the differences in how we share it, right? We might share it in different ways in terms of disparities, access, availability, language. So thinking about race, class, gender, indigeneity, ability, and so forth, how does that inform the conversation surrounding environmental issues, particularly around water? And so we'll come back to the digital realm and ask you, Lisa, if you mind responding, and then we'll keep going from there.
Yes. Thank you. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and it comes up in our show too. So I'll be curious to see how people react. I live down here in the South, and the area between New Orleans and Houston is often referred to as Cancer Alley because of there's so many refineries that are polluting the air, and there's so many cases of cancer, and so many of the people who live on the fence lines of those refineries are people of color. And there's some really amazing, and that air quality issue is also a water quality issue, obviously. And what I've been inspired by recently is the activists who are really working to make change in this area. There's a group in St. Charles Parish called Rise St. James that has, in many ways, is successfully starting to push some of these refineries out of their neighborhood. And they are led primarily by Black women. And I've been very inspired by their work. There's another group here in New Orleans that is working to restore access to an area of Lake Pontchartrain, which is right on the edge of New Orleans, called Lincoln Beach, which in the 50s and 60s, there was an area of the lake where you could swim called Pontchartrain Beach, which was for white people. And then there was Lincoln Beach, which was, segregated for Black people. Over time, both of those beaches have become closed, but there is actually zero access to Lincoln Beach. There's a railroad now. You can't even get to the water. And this is the area called New Orleans East, which again has one of the larger Black populations in the city. And so this organization, they just gave me and some of my environmentalist friends a tour. And just to get to the beach, we had to climb up. It felt like we were trespassing. We had to climb up a ladder and climb over the railroad tracks. And when we got to the beach, there were all of these people swimming. So there were people who want access to the water, who want to be able to enjoy it, to be able to be in it. But there's just hardly any way for them to get there. Luckily, this group has worked with the city to get a huge grant to start to work on restoring that access. But it's interesting to me when we think about these issues that, we read a lot about, people having to live in neighborhoods where they're breathing unhealthy air, but sometimes it's just like you're living right there, the water is right there, and you're not allowed to touch it. So it's something that I'm thinking about a lot lately in terms of if we all had more access to water, I think we'd all be better off. So
Thank you.
I'll turn it over to someone else.
Sarah, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. One thing I have been thinking about, I'm hearing what you're saying about environmentalism historically has been kind of a white project and has recently had to come to terms with the fact that it has co-opted a lot of ideas. And I think that environmental justice is something that's really inspiring me. This understanding that's come into the environmental movement that if one is not well, no one is well, none of us are well. And so I think about, I guess something I kind of heard growing up in environmental studies in a program as an undergrad was this idea that like social justice and environmental work are separate, but it's all wildly interconnected. And that's something I'm really interested in, especially I think of the work of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone up along the Bear River, their work restoring Wuda-Ogwa, the site of the Bear River Massacre. They have really been leading some of this work, turning our culture and our overculture toward the more than human as sentient and alive, and honoring water. And so I think, there's a lot there. And then I also think a lot about gender. I think maybe specifically performing as a woman, learning from water and from birds, and in kind of this, I don't know, being in the legislative, I testified yesterday or a couple days ago in a legislative decision-making committee, and just, thought about like what it means to be a woman doing this work. And like I call the lake a she, and I notice that's kind of common language. And I wonder what that means for her disposability in our culture and kind of a patriarchal culture. So I don't know, this is a lot of rambling, I guess, but there are a lot of different places, I guess, where there's just intersectional work happening that relies upon like the knowledges and leadership of folks who have historically maybe been left out of these conversations, but always been leading.
Daniel, I hope this is germane to your question, and it's been a few minutes since I heard the question, but I heard terms like gender differences and things like that, and how do we approach and perhaps customize our message, depending on who our audience is. With regard to gender, this is a little bit of a detour, but I wrote a book recently about how and why women are smarter than men. My wife told me I had to write it, by the way. But there's actually a significant gender difference between the impact on males versus females in terms of their ability to ward off the impacts of environmental neurotoxins. And in fact, if you look at increasing data, women have become smarter than men based on so many different criteria. And my thesis on that book is that it's because there is a hormonal and significant chemical difference in the ability of males versus females to ward off the kinds of impacts of various environmental toxins in terms of brain development. Talking about generations and genders and things like that, I think if we're going to try and make an impression on people about the importance of these issues, it's important to try and customize our message. To an older generation, I think I would push the message of we have a moral obligation to younger generations. Children are much more physiologically and long-term impacted by environmental contaminants than adults are. And so to an audience of adults, I say, you have a moral obligation to try and protect the health and the lifespan of the children who follow. To children, I say, there's also a moral obligation, but you are the ones most affected, so you should be the ones that are the most engaged. And you need to sort out what kind of lessons you learn from your previous generation that are good and which are bad, and try and rise above those that have obviously been harmful. every time I think about success I might have had in convincing someone in power, a legislator, someone in the governor's office, about the importance of environmental protection, whether it's air pollution, water pollution, chemical contaminants, if you can customize it and make it personal to them, you have a much better chance of having them see your perspective and becoming an eventual ally. When I think about those legislators who I think I've actually made a difference with, it's almost always because they have identified someone in their family who's being harmed by the issue I'm trying to raise. We have an office person who's 28 years old, healthy, outdoors, loving, couldn't be a more vigorous person, who developed sudden onset life-threatening asthma during our worst air pollution day of about a month ago. Her whole life now has changed. She has gone from healthy, vigorous, no cares in the world, and intellectually engaged in our crusade to now someone whose personal livelihood, safety, and health is intimately wrapped up in what we're doing. So if you can make any of these messages personal, I think that's very helpful if you're trying to persuade people.
So one thing you mentioned there was generational, and so I'm going to combine a couple of questions, just being mindful of the clock as well. And so there's a couple of questions that we had, and I'm going to put them together. And one is thinking about generational differences in language. And so one of those things that I wanted to bring up as an example of that is today I hear, for example, in like activist realms or in the mainstream, criticisms of actions that don't seem meaningful being labeled as performative, right? And at the same time, having artists on the panel as well and understanding the power of performance arts, wondering, how meanings change over time, across generations, across locations. And so if there's any examples that you can think of that speak to how to communicate across generations, and perhaps if you would like to comment on, performative versus performance. I mean, for me, performance is very powerful. To say something is performative, to me, is saying that it's doing something. It may not be doing what we want it to do, right? It might not actually have any actions behind the statement, but by saying it, it's doing something as well, at least for me. So, and that might be a generational thing for me as well, right? So that's something to think about. So we'll go back to you, Lisa. If generational differences in terms of language or meaning, and or think about performance.
Great, that's a lot. What comes to mind? I recently in New Orleans helped co-organize a Gulf South artist and cultural organizing environmental justice convening, which brought together people from Houston, Louisiana, and Mississippi to talk about a lot of these issues. And we, the organizers, I'm in my early 50s, and we kept trying to find, well, actually, no, I'm going to say we did not do a great job of pulling in teenagers. We asked a few people that were involved in the Sunrise Movement. In the end, we wound up talking to 2 teenagers who were very involved in the EJ movement, and we showed them our itinerary, and there were creative sessions, there were panel discussions, there was a performance you could go to, and they were like, we'll go on this bus tour down to the water and past the chemical plants because that's you guys actually doing something. They're like, we're not going to do any of the other stuff because you're not doing anything. And we were like, note taken, great. And so that was really interesting to me, both realizing how much work we needed to do to actually bring them into our fold and into our conversation for the next conference, which will be happening in Houston. But I also just think that, this African concept of Sankofa, which is looking back to move forward, comes up a lot in New Orleans. And at the same conference, we had a panel discussion, performative, about an environmental justice performance festival that happened in New Orleans in 1997. And it was a very important moment in New Orleans. And there were like 15 different works of performance that were commissioned about environmental justice. And there were elders that were involved that were on that panel. There were younger performers that were on the panel. The discussion was very lively. I would say, like, literally the panelists were kind of getting out of their seats to have this discussion. And the people that were at this conference were learning about this for the first time and completely inspired to take this into their next phase of work. So it was really amazing to me to think about the intergenerational nature of the work, how hard it can be, again, to break those cycles, and how joyful it can be when you do bring all those people into the same room.
Right. Back to you, Sarah, and then Brian.
Okay. Yeah, I want to echo this, like the power of intergenerational work, and in activist spaces specifically. I'm thinking about the work of Michael Mead, who talks a lot about eldering and good eldering, and he talks about how if you have a space that is just youth focused or just elder focused, like you will miss out on a lot of knowledge and understanding. And so some of the most powerful things that I've been a part of, and hello microphone, that I've been a part of and observed are ones that do include this like elder focused work and youth focused work, and figuring out how to make those speak to each other, because I think we live in a culture that sort of separates the two oftentimes. And I think of our decision-making bodies and how a lot of it is made up of elders. And I think that we're maybe awakening to this need for a lot of a more interwoven work. And then as far as the performance and performative question, I think immediately of social media. I think of this reality that you can like perform activism on social media by posting something and feeling like you've done something, you've contributed, you've said, you know, I support the lake, and that there's been a lot of criticism for that as like a way for folks to feel good about themselves and move on. I do think that it is powerful, though. We are social creatures and we are constantly performing, and so I think that I don't know. I'm not totally. I understand that. We don't want performative spaces and that's an issue. And I think that our social power can come from like folks feeling that that causes that we want are what other people are engaging in and joining that cause. And so, yeah, I don't know, lots of thoughts. But.
Yeah.
When I think of the intersection between the generational divide and our failures in public policy, especially environmental public policies, to me, the common denominator is lack of empathy. There are certain groups that are most sensitive to air pollution's impacts. Everybody's affected, whether they have any symptoms or not, but those who are most affected are the elderly and the very youngest. And for people who don't think that we need to take care of people on the extremes of our population, to me, that's a manifestation of a lack of empathy. When I think about failure or reluctance or foot dragging when it comes to saving the Great Salt Lake, to me, I interpret it this way. It's a lack of empathy towards those people who are going to be the most impacted. And if there's one thing I could plead for, especially in today's current political environment, and I won't be any more specific than that for the moment, but to me, the common denominator of all the problems that we have societally right now is we have drifted away from empathy towards each other. If we could recapture that, a lot of the problems that we're kind of tangentially representing today could be meaningfully addressed and perhaps disaster averted.
I'm going to stay with you, Brian, for this last set of questions, because I do want to make sure we have a chance for audience to ask some questions as well. And so for the last thing, right, let's call it critical hope, because let's not ignore the doom that we face. But what is an example of something that gives you hope in this conversation, in the crisis that we face, that you can share? And then, yeah.
Well, what gives me hope is the fact that we're having events like this. And we're having this performance of this ocean filibuster in a few weeks. I think the more people learn about how their behaviors and governmental policy is affecting their fellow men, women, and so forth, I do think that there's a spark of hope in me that people are starting to respond to that. If people just started caring more about each other, so much of this would be solved. And so I see sparks of that. I obviously would love to see a lot more. I'm distressed when I see a total lack of it in social media, in the media in general, in politics. But I still see primarily significant sparks of that I think can be cultivated, and in many cases spread, resurrected and spread.
Sarah?
That's a big question. Wow. Gosh, what comes immediately to mind is I think about last year I did a little personal project with one of these bird heads I'm talking about, this like big phalarope mask moving outside of the Capitol during the legislative session, just trying to move as phalarope as I could. And I just had this like little vision and wanted to be there and represent like a bird in this decision-making body just for the passing cars. I did it like right in front of the Capitol. And it felt, as I think a lot of folks around lake work have felt, like it's just a little tiny thing that no one will notice. And I know I've spoken with scientists who've been working on lake issues for a long time and other folks. And for a long time, it kind of felt like each of us was like this tiny little island. And what's giving me hope is seeing people rally around this work. Like you've said, that we're having this conversation, that just this morning at 8 a.m., there were a bunch of people dressed up as brine shrimp and birds and carrying waves dyed with local waters walking around the Capitol. That gives me hope to see these growing movements, to see all of you listening, and I'm sure each of you engaging in these issues in your own ways. Yeah, I do have a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of honest fear and good room for criticism, and I do believe in the potential for a better world.
Lisa, last word to you.
Thank you. That work at the Capitol sounds so amazing. I hope I can see it sometime. I'm finding hope in small grassroots, almost neighborhood projects here in New Orleans. So things that feel small but have kind of emergent impact. I'm thinking about there's a group of artists and activists who are creating the project is called Nani Bulbuncha, and Bulbuncha is a Choctaw word for New Orleans that means the place of many tongues. And they're building a native mound. It's a group of native artists and activists that is for an art exhibition, but it is a process that is bringing together many people. There are work days. We were weaving palmetto mats to go into the mound. We were seeing the structure of irrigation that was created with oyster shells. There's many different kinds of clay coming in to make this mound. And so although we're seeing a work of art, it's all of these people coming together, meeting each other, and literally getting their hands dirty to connect with the earth. And there are several other examples of that in New Orleans, of neighborhood groups or small groups working in that way. And I will also mention organizations like Ocean Conservancy, which is a big organization, but they've been doing these pilot programs where one of their grants is called Decarbonize the Ports. And they're specifically giving micro grants to organizations that are BIPOC led by Black, Indigenous people of color, who are doing environmental justice work in port cities. And the relatively small grant that they gave to Junebug Productions here in New Orleans really helped us make this whole convening. So it was like a little bit of money that had huge impact for us, and that brought together a lot of environmentalists and activists who really needed the time together. So seeing how, in some ways, things that look small can actually have large impact.
Thank you. At this point, I'm going to turn it back to Hinckley Institute.
Hey, everybody. If you have a question for the panelists, raise your hand. Anybody?
We need to do a better job of scaring everybody.
Hello. I recently learned about the Grass River in upstate New York and the relationship that indigenous peoples have with it, including the relationship with harmful corporations that have polluted the river and such. And sorry, one second. And I was wondering if there were any specific collaborations or efforts or things that would work against corporations who don't have empathy and who don't have the best interest at heart for the people that live in the areas around water and such.
Is your question, how do we make corporations empathetic?
If it's possible.
Well, you probably have seen glimpses of discussion in the media over the last couple of years about the idea of corporations having personhood. You know, Mitt Romney famously said during several political debates when he was running for president in 2012, well, corporations are people, my friend. Well, actually, no, they're not. They're actually heavily insulated from the consequences that normal people face for bad behavior. If a corporation misbehaves, does anybody go to jail? It may go bankrupt, but inevitably no. Most of you look a little too young to have been terribly engaged in the economic collapse of 2008. But those of you who are old enough to have cared about it then, how many Wall Street bankers went to jail as a result of all the fraud that collapsed our economy in 2008? Might have been one. One, okay. 0 or what? That is a perfect example of the differentiation between the consequences to corporations and the consequences to individuals. And so we need to transform our laws such that corporations can suffer the same kinds of consequences for their behavior that individuals do. In fact, the other book I wrote was called Death by Corporation: The Killing of Humankind in the Age of Monster Corporations. And the book was all about numerous examples of how the very business model of these corporations involved callously precipitating, if not outright causing, death. And the number of corporations whose business model was that is almost too long to mention. It's the tobacco industry, it's the drug industry, it's the fossil fuel industry. It's in some ways it's the finance industry, because the finance industry is financing projects that we know are leading to our demise. So it's the automobile industry. You remember the Volkswagen Dieselgate? They knew enough about what air pollution does that they were killing people with those kinds of business models and policies, but they did it anyway. So we have to have better governmental policy to make corporations behave with the same consequences that individuals would.
And if I can add just a little bit onto the rights of nature comment, I have been lucky to spend some time in Chile and Ecuador and New Zealand, where folks have been pioneering giving bodies of water and other more than human entities rights to be considered as a person with a right to exist and to live and to thrive. And this is working. This is taking off in different parts of the world and even in our own country. Some states are adopting this approach. So I do have hope in that for kind of fighting this corporate greed and issue that we're facing.
Perfect. We have time for one more question, if anyone wants to ask one.
Yeah, I didn't hear much talked about with the Great Salt Lake of an actual solution to any of the specific problems we're facing. So I was wondering if you guys had any input on that, or any steps we can take to actually, yeah, get to an end and resolution on that.
I want to give, if you have any thoughts, I don't want to.
Lisa, could you hear that one?
Yes, I think that they were asking for solutions to the problems of the Great Salt Lake.
Yeah. Just wanted to see if
Yeah.
give you a chance if
I
you
heard
wanted
it,
to.
yeah. I don't know much about that, but I'm excited to see if I can learn.
Yeah, I've been excited to work on a Rights of Nature committee with Save Our Great Salt Lake. And we are looking at how to move forward with that approach. There are a lot of different approaches. There was just a bill submitted a couple days ago with some mechanisms for keeping lake levels high enough to maintain a good salinity level. So there are a lot of different approaches that I could speak to, but the one that I'm really excited about is a Rights of Nature approach that essentially sees the lake as a being that has the right to support the millions of migratory birds who depend on her thriving. The brine shrimp industry, our air quality, like so many pieces of our culture and other beings tied to her well-being. So I have a lot of hope with Rights of Nature, with bringing her into our legal frameworks and approaches. But I do also feel like it's important to say that there are a lot of ways into this. And yeah, there are a lot of potential solutions. And I think we're at a key moment where we're trying to like narrow in on some of those. The obvious one being getting water to the lake and having mechanisms for that. So, yeah.
Our group is one of the groups that is a plaintiff in the lawsuit to try and force the state's hand to save the lake. And if you want to know what solutions are, you have to look at where the money is. And the money is in saving the lake is where are our biggest sources of water consumption. By far, the biggest source of water consumption is agriculture. I'm going to be fairly blunt here. I have nothing against farmers. We all need them. And I have nothing against the farmers in Utah. Absolutely. We need them and we need to support them. But here's the reality of the situation. Agriculture consumes about 70% of the water that would otherwise go to the lake. The overwhelming majority of that goes to alfalfa. About 30+% of that alfalfa gets shipped to Saudi Arabia and China and other Asian countries. So the bottom line is we're literally boxing up our water in the form of alfalfa and we're shipping it to foreign countries. How much sense does that make? I mean, maybe you could make a case for that in a state that wasn't in a perilous drought and looking for that to become worse and worse and worse as the climate crisis evolves. But we're going to have to face the reality of where is our water consumption, and that's where it is. That doesn't mean we have to put alfalfa farmers into poverty. Absolutely not. They can be compensated in various ways. But let's talk about reality. How can we save it? That's what the reality is.
So unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. But Daniel, do you have any final remarks as our moderator?
I'll just say thanks. Y'all were really easy to moderate. My people, I have to interrupt because they're like me, long-winded. So y'all were great. Thank you so much for your insights and being concise. I don't know, do you do the round of applause for these folks? Or?
Thank you guys so much for coming. Please welcome and joining me in thanking our moderators.
Sweet.